So this is a meeting on eco-hydrology in semi-arid region, and I guess that over the meeting this point was made that the semi-arid region, they take a significant proportion of the land surface, something in the order of 17%. We usually focus on carbon cycle research or carbon and water, and one of the major efforts, global efforts in that sense, is the FluxNet community. And you can see that there's a very poor correlation between semi-arid region and semi-arid environment and efforts in this huge project of about 500 to 600 flux tower with a lot of investment. And the semi-arid regions are barely covered. So we took up this challenge, and we just decided to join this effort and set up a flux site here in Israel. So we take advantage of our location in the Eastern Mediterranean, and in fact went all the way to the what we call the dry timberland, the edge of forestation. And we set up a flux site. We started with low budget in a junkyard, but eventually we ended up with what we think is a state-of-the-art flux system in the Yakir forest, which is right here at the edge of this dark Mediterranean vegetation, and it's about half an hour drive from here. This has been working for over 10 years now, and we now extend activities by using a mobile flux system, but I will focus on data that came up from this site. Of course, it's not only the big guns, we also have to do a lot of auxiliary measurements, TDRs below ground, measuring subflow with graniers or Chermak, like Ram has mentioned, dendrometries, plant physiology, and so on. And we also use the same ecosystem model that Ram has mentioned, Musica, and we collaborate extensively with Jérôme Auger, the creator of this model, but today I will actually focus mostly on data, on observations. So this is the Yakir forest. So it's a good-looking forest, surprisingly. It's not irrigated. It's not fertilized. The only management that was done over its almost 50 years of lifetime is, I think, 2 cycles of thinning. It was planted in high density, and now it's about 300 trees per hectare. Precipitation is about 280 millimeters annually on long-term average, and you can see the large internal variation, including the drought years recently that I understand were mentioned a couple of times. And you can see that the forest is undergoing every year a very long drought of something like 250 years with no rain, from about this time of the year until November in the next winter. VPD is very high. Every summer it gets to about 4,000 Pascal, 4 kilopascal, and many times reach 6,000. So it's typical semi-arid to dry environment. And surprisingly, the forest is doing quite well. So we came to the forest 45 years after it was planted. Scientists were not consulted in the mid-60s when it was planted. They just wanted to green the desert, to green this semi-arid area, and surprisingly, they were successful. The forest is not only looking good, but is providing what we call ecosystem services, recreation, which is modeled here by our team Picnic, which is very well known in the country. We're producing, the forest is to some extent harvested, very little firewood is produced, and recreation, as I said. But the main point I want to mention is the carbon sequestration potential. So carbon sequestration we measure as net ecosystem exchange, NEE, and you can see here a comparison of Yakir of about 220 kilograms per hectare of carbon, which compares very well with the global average for the FluxNet, and even better to the average for pine forest in Europe. And you can already see one of the key to this performance. You see that the gross primary productivity, the flux into the forest, the photosynthetic flux in the temperate forest is very large, but also the respiration losses are very large. The semi-arid forest tends to be very modest in terms of GBP, but also very modest in terms of of respiration, and what we measure as a sink is actually the balance between two. So when you have high uptake and high loss, and low uptake and low losses, you end up with the same carbon sink. So that was one surprise, but it's only part of the picture, and we spent the 10 years actually trying to explain some of the other details involved. I want to give you right away the bottom line, and then you can choose if to stick around or not. We want to say that in contrast to the devastating effects of extreme events, and this is an example of one of the iconic extreme events, the 2003 heat waves in Europe, that in the Fluxnet community, it was shown that in one hot and dry summer, the carbon equivalent of more than 5 years was lost, and it took more than 5 years to recover from such a heat wave. So these are very dramatic effects. So if we shift from extreme events to extreme environment, which is the environment that our forest is experiencing, we see in the induction of a range of adjustments, and this will potentially keep forest ecosystem active and with significant carbon sequestration and other ecosystem services, even if some areas that today are not under extreme environment will shift more gradually than through extreme events to such. So when we talk about climate change and the future of forestation and vegetation, we have to make the distinction between extreme events and extreme environments, and I think the Yakir forest is supposed to be a model for what can happen in extreme environment, all the adjustment that can happen. And I want to show you some of those adjustments. For example, if we normalize the GPP, or the carbon uptake of a forest, and only look at the seasonal cycle and the temperature, we see a picture like this. So if you go from Finland, where these Fluxnet station, through I think Belgium, France, Spain, all the way to Israel, we see a very significant shift in the phenology. The time of activity shifts by several months, almost 6 months. And if you look at the temperature during the time of peak activity, of course, all of them are northern hemisphere, so they all have a similar seasonal pattern, but the temperature of seasonal activity looks very stable. It's sort of a large-scale homeostatic behavior of the forest that help maintain activity. So the peak activity here in the forest is actually in March, February, March. You can see also adjustment on the daily scale. So you see here, of course, uptake here, photosynthesis is positive. Here is more the way we measure it is removal from the atmosphere, so negative values. So this is the uptake of CO2 on the daily cycle, and you see in the winter, very nice daily cycle, and you see the shift in the summer to very early morning, but the system actually remains active throughout the year. We don't have this dormancy, we don't have a snow and ice-covered period, and in fact, it's even carbon positive almost the entire year. We also see very clearly the resilience of the forest that is reflecting some of the adjustment. And one dramatic example of this is during what we call Hamsin events. These are short heat waves that happen especially this time of the year, the transition period between winter and summer. And you have a very dramatic increase in temperature in VPD. So nothing is changing. The soil moisture, this is too rapid for changes. The phenology doesn't change. It's mostly the plant response. And what we see is as VPD jumps up within 3 days, the photosynthetic uptake goes dramatically down. But within 24 hours, you see the green one, we have full recovery of the system. So the system can respond strongly to changes in VPD and temperature, but shows a full recovery. It's interesting that this is also a useful system to separate the effect of VPD, atmospheric stress, and soil moisture. And if you look at the slope of this line, of this response, if you collect, and we now have 150 or so Hamsin events over the year, you can see that the slope of this change with the period, and this is described here. So this is the slope of this response to VPD as it's changing in response to the drying of the soil. So the more drying the soil, the more shallow the response of the plant to VPD. The energy budget of a semi-arid forest is also interesting. You can see here typical situation where the net radiation is almost quantitatively matched by the sensible heat. So the latent heat and the transpiration is a very small component, and you only see it becoming significant very early in the season, around February to about this time. But most of the year, you see it's a very small component. This usually creates a problem of overheating, because evaporation is the major cooling system for a forest, especially temperate forests that are essentially a sponge of water. And evaporation is the main cooling mechanism. But not to worry, it turns out that semi-arid forest just shifted from water cooling to air cooling system. And this is related to the fact that the semi-arid forest must be a low density to be sustainable, and the low density forest has a very efficient coupling with the atmosphere, low resistance, and become a sort of a convector with very efficient production of sensible heat. And the temperature of the surface, the skin temperature of the forest, on annual average is 5 degrees Celsius cooler than the surrounding. And in the summer, actually, we can find up to 30 degrees differences between the skin temperature of the forest and the shrubland outside the forest. So a very effective change in the cooling system. There's some changes that occur due to what happens around us, independent of the capacity of the forest or the plants themselves to adjust. And one, we think, is a response to the increasing CO2. If we use tree rings to extend the record of our 10 years measurements to something like 30, 35 years, we see a very clear increase in water use efficiency derived from C13 analysis of tree rings. And this is true for everywhere we look in Israel. This is 3 sites from our Yakir forest all the way to the Carmel and the Judean hills. And you can even see that the slope tends to increase as you go to drying condition. So something like 25% increase in water use efficiency, the ratio of carbon uptake to water loss. And by looking at, we don't have a control experiment, but by a process of elimination, we look at the temperature effect, the precipitation effect, the age effect. Our conclusion is that this is the effect of increasing CO2 in the atmosphere and not anything else. Another help the system gets from the environment is the soil property. What we found, at least in Yakir, but we think, and we have been testing this in other forests, is that it benefits much from the fact that there is a strong gradient in the composition of the soil composition as you go from the surface to depth, with an increasing clay content. If you do the water retention, the classical water retention curves for the different layers, you find an interesting phenomena, and that is that in the deep layer, you reach the water potential, which is actually the water potential that we know from physiology result with stomatal closure. And stomata do close in these pine trees, and there's no nighttime transpiration, in this case. But you end up with a relatively shallow layer where you already cannot transpire water when there's a lot of water in the soil. That looks like a big waste, and in fact, it always amazes us that we can come in drought years and see trees are dying, and when we look at the soil moisture profile, we see that there's still a lot of moisture in the soil. On the other hand, when we started to use the Musica model that was mentioned, and as I say, we're not going to go into detail in this, but this is just an example where the model was very helpful. We noticed that before we had the profile, and we used some measured values, but of a bulk profile, the model was keep killing our forest. It was always dying in the model. And this only was solved when we finally put the detailed profiles of this increase in clay. So you can see that the clay not only keeps the water, but it prevents the loss of water to depth. So it creates some sort of a water bath at the root zone. So in fact, there is a certain amount of wasted water that remains there, but all the rest of the little water that the forest gets stays in the root zone, is not lost to depths. You can see here some of the measurements and the run, and you see this is when we use the bulk number, and the soil lost water too much and the forest dry out. When we improved this parameterization, suddenly matching with the data was improved and the forest survived. So this is another key parameter is the soil properties which are not physiological control, and sometimes it can be fortuitous, but it turned out to be more general than we thought. This is how the hydrological budget of the forest look like in a typical year. I said the average is about 280, 290 millimeters. So this is a number that Tamir produced with some data from Naama to represent the typical year. So if this is considered 100% of the input to the system, we see that there is a loss from interception from the canopy of about 11%. There is virtually no runoff in the system compared to the shrubland that are open, where the runoff can be sometimes tens of percent. The forest totally eliminate runoff, and it's quite amazing to come in a very stormy day, and then we run to the runoff collection station down at the bottom of the watershed, and we wait for something to come out, and there's nothing that comes out even in the worst storm. So the forest is very effective in eliminating runoff. And there is a significant evaporation all the way from the surface of the soil before the rain actually have any significant penetration. The rest, so this amounts in a typical year to 61 millimeters. The rest is penetrating or infiltrating to the soil. And still, soil evaporation is a significant component. If you add it up, this is about 20% already lost to soil evaporation. And Tamir terms the rest as transpirable water content. So this is what is now available for the tree for transpiration and to do all this optimization with the carbon system that we just heard before. It turns out that there are additional losses because it's not only tree in the system. We have understory transpiration to the annuals and the other plants that is losing significant amount. And we have a residual that may be some recharge to depths. By the way, there's no contribution from groundwater. Groundwater in this area is about 300 meters deep, so it's out of the picture, greatly simplifying the budget. So this is how it looks, and it's interesting that today with the tree density in the forest, which, as I said, is about 30 trees per dунum, 300 trees per hectare, providing about 60-65% coverage, turns out to be very near the optimum for the hydrology of the budget. And this was produced empirically by the forester, the KKL, they manage the forest, and just by observing, not by a very sophisticated scientific method, it turns out that they reach essentially the optimum density, where we have almost full utilization of the water in soil evaporation, interception, and transpiration. If we reduce the density, we will have some excess water that either will produce runoff, or you can use it for any other purpose. If you go to higher density, probably mortality will increase. Now to things that were mentioned in the previous talks. It turns out that at least the pine forest that we have, Pinus halepensis, likes to live at the edge. So this is the hydraulic safety margin, another way to look at the topic that was mentioned just in the previous talk. And you can see typical pictures from various plants where plants close the stomata well below the point where we have what we call PLC 50, when the hydraulic conductivity goes down by 50%, and you expect the cavitation will become a significant damage to the system. And the distance between stomatal closure and PLC 50 is the safety margin. And you can see the plants tend to have a good size safety margin, but not in these plants that have to survive in the dry environment. They actually have a very narrow safety margin, almost no safety margin at all. So they keep the stomata open all the way as much as possible, because they're very limited in times and conditions that can actually do the optimization exercises between carbon and water. and the conductive system is very vulnerable, but they take full advantage of it and even take the risk of exposing the conductant system to loss of conductivity. And in fact, it seems that these trees, and it might be some of the adjustment that have been done as we move to drier conditions, evolutionary or environmentally, is that maybe they don't care about losing conductivity because it looks like they do it a couple of times a day. So we don't see any major changes in conductivity or in PLC over the diurnal cycle in the winter, but as you go into the spring and the summer in May and June, you can see that in fact this is increasing PLC, so loss of conductivity is going up early in the morning. There's a recovery of conductivity to full scale, and then another big loss, a very dense cycle in the spring and a more slower cycle, but still maintaining this very high dynamic. This was a big surprise. This is not a very common situation, certainly not in conifers, but Tamir, who has been measuring this, has done this. Each case is at least 3 different trees, and you see this here in 2 occasions, and there are a couple of more occasions. So this is a very consistent this dynamic. Here we take one example and relate it to stomatal conductance, and you see that stomata open very early in the morning to allow gas exchange, and we will see this in the next slide. But as these stomata remain open and some deficit is formed in the trees, the loss of conductance is climbing up. At a certain point, stomata close. It's sort of a midday closure, which is exactly the time of recovery. There's a small increase of stomata conductance, reopening in the afternoon, actually not so small as significant, but not as big as in the morning. Interestingly, this is enough to result with another major loss of conductivity. If we take a step back and look at some other parameters, it looks like a very interesting hydrological system. So here we have the light. So this is power. This is the light cycle of the day. And we can see that the gas exchange is displaced relative to the solar cycle. So this is a simulation taking advantage of the condition early in the morning, in the afternoon, with a very strong midday depression. This is VPD. So you see VPD is going way up. This is in June to 4 kilopascal. And stomatal conductance that is avoiding this high VPD. In fact, when VPD goes to above a certain threshold, then it's maybe one of the signs that signify stomatal closure. Stomata goes way down, and there's another cycle of opening and closing in the afternoon. Probably the closing here is a dark period. And you can see not much conductance at night. The subflow, so now transpiration, of course, follows this increase in stomatal conductance. So stomatal conductance is what controls the gas exchange. So water loss, transpiration, and assimilation follow the stomatal conductance. But this is completely displaced from the subflow. So the subflow, the peak in subflow sometimes can be displayed by up to 9 hours over the diurnal cycle between this peak and the peak in the subflow. And as a result, the tree actually developed a water budget deficit of something like 5 kilograms per tree. So a very significant deficit. It also means that about a third of the transpiration must come from storage and not a direct coupling from the soil to the transpiration flux. And this deficit in this ability to continue to transpire on the storage is probably what is behind the developing of this loss of conductivity, especially here in the morning and again in the afternoon. So very unusual dynamic system, very strong decoupling between the flux from the soil into the tree, from the tree to the atmosphere. We don't have time to go into this, but in fact, this is what I was trying to point out here. The transpiration is related to stomatal conductance in VPD, which is driving, increasing the flux here. But the subflow is related to the gradient, in the hydraulic gradient in the plant. We just heard about it from Gabi, and the conductance, which is going through this very strong dynamic. I want to end up with just a comment that all these measurements were done on Pinus halepensis, and we show a range, and of course, out of this 10 years of half a dozen PhD theses, these were just some highlights that I thought are related to the topic of the meeting. But the point was to show that there's a lot of adjustment and adaptation that allow forests to be successful under these conditions, and maybe these conditions represent what will happen in other regions of the world in the next century. I just wanted to point out also from the work of Tamir that when he looked at different provenances from around the Mediterranean, and he collected, worked on 5 specific ones, and he measured the activity in 3 locations, in near Rome and in 2 locations in Israel, and he measured 7 physiological characteristics. Out of those, he noticed that 3 seems to be key to the survival in semi-arid or dry conditions. And the point that I want to make is that one of them is, of course, the loss of conductivity. Another one is the growth season lengths. So another way to avoid the stress of the semi-arid environment is to shorten the growth season lengths and make it more intensive. And the other one is what is efficiency that we indicated is going up. But the point is that you need a combination of these. None of them alone is enough to survive in the harsh condition of Yakir, certainly if these are getting even worse. And this is what it's trying to depict here. We found that the best, in terms of survival, the best provenances are those that are close to this focal point that incorporate the advantage of these 3 key elements. And I think with this I will stop. A lot of the work that I mentioned has been published. Some of the new data on this PLC dynamics is actually now being revised. But Naama had several papers on the eco-hydrology of the forest. Eyal, that I mentioned, did a lot of the energy and latent heat, including a paper in Science a couple of years ago. And Tamir is now just completing his studies with a very nice set of papers. And with this, I will thank you. I think I was on time, so we have a couple of minutes for questions. Yeah.
So the increase in water use efficiency, is there evidence in other places in the world of a 10-year period where you have 25%? And another thing, what is the cause? Is it carbon or water or a combination? Less water or more growth?
Yes, we are not the only one that show increase. There always argument about what it reflects, but the trend of increasing what is efficiency is seen in many other places. In Spain, there's a lot of similar work in the States. So this is general. It's not universal, but it's relatively widespread. What caused the increase in what is efficient is not clear. I was trying to point out that in our analysis, by a process of elimination, we look at age effect, and those curves that I showed reflect different age stands, and that doesn't seem to be a cause. Precipitation doesn't change in Israel. Precipitation is very noisy, as it was shown before, but there's no trend in precipitation so far. Temperature is going up, actually going up in Israel above the average, the global average, but to the best of our knowledge, based on a lot of physiological measurement, it's not temperature. So we believe it's at least in our case, it's CO2 effect. Yes, Rob?
Yes. Oh, sure. Okay. I was wondering, it seems like your plants are, or the trees are highly dependent on stored water, which is another form of hydraulic redistribution. At night, you take moisture from the soil, especially in your case, because Tamara is closed, and you put it into the tree, and then you use it during the day, which probably support quite a lot of your carbon uptake. But I haven't seen capacitance, tree capacitance for water storage and water release as one of the variables that you looked as as no, the general sort of figure that you looked at characteristics that make trees work well in such environments, and could it be that if you planted, if another species was planted there with lower capacitance, you would actually have a dead forest by now?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think for forests to survive, you either have to plant the right species or you have to wait until the right species arrive there. But I think one of the points I was making at the end is that there is a range of provenances that allow you some flexibility in this. Now, for example, we compare this pine with oaks, and we want to see oak, for example, transpire twice as much as pine trees under the same conditions. So maybe you're right. If this was oak, we will not see such a nice forest, but maybe they have other tricks. Just to point out about the capacitance, I didn't mention it. This is dendrometry or micro-dendrometry. So you can see some indication of exactly of what you're saying, that this very strong diurnal cycle in the capacitance of the tree, that is actually, you can actually see it.
And Menachem Moshe Leon will tell you to measure
you can listen to it.
Yeah. Moisture content of the tree.
Yeah. Okay, yes, sorry.
Yes. I wanted also to reflect on your water use efficiency and the tree ring isotopes, because there's quite a lot of studies for tropical forests that there's a huge debate about the age, and in fact that they mainly measure the difference in the ages in the growth, and that was reflected in the increase in water use efficiency. But apparently you find not a dependency on age. And could it be related that it is a dry environment instead of a wet environment? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it could. You know, all the sites that we measure are relatively dry. I don't think it's easy to compare with tropical conditions. And yes, there are many studies with tree rings, with isotopes, and the conclusions are variable. But I think in dry condition, in some temperate conditions, especially in pine and conifers, there is increase in water efficiency that is not related to age. By the way, this water efficiency is already published in Ecologia, I think last year, where we go through all these arguments. So I invite you to go through it. Maybe from this side, last question. And go ahead.
I was really struck by the common 18-degree C time of productivity. And you know, that brings up all sorts of questions about the psychometric curve and whether it's trying to get down to a place where you don't lose a lot of water. I'm just wondering what other literature there is on that, and is there any potential that that if you exceed that temperature, then the forest might not be successful?
I don't know if there are too many data on this. That probably helps us to put this in Science a couple of years ago. So because there are not too much data on this. But I think phenological adjustment is not something new, and the fact that seasonality is adjusting to the location. The fact that the temperature range turns out to be so narrow was surprising. Yakir still have some range to go. So even temperature goes up, I don't think it's the edge or the end of the capacity. Now I think the peak is in end of March, April, and there's still a way to go to make adjustments. So, but eventually at certain point you reach the limit of any ecosystem.
But you do see that as a fundamental temperature that has some meaning.
I think so, yeah, although there can be some adjustment in these too. All right, we have to move on, and quickly call the next speaker, Todd Scalon.